Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Making the Argument podcast. Nick Freitas is currently in the air, flying from Southern California back over to Virginia. Last night, he was able to speak to over 200 folks at a high school in Southern California, had a great event with Young Americans for Freedom. But today, we have a really interesting episode, and of course, we're joined by the one and only Ms. Tina Freitas.
Hello, everyone.
And our political prognosticator, Christian Hines.
Hello.
I got to the studio Sunday night, and Christian asked me what my thoughts were on everything related to the tariffs, and I told him I had been listening to this video and that video, was still collecting information. I asked him what he thought, and his response really surprised me, and I didn't understand him. And so he pointed me to this video, and so we sat up in the studio till about midnight on Sunday watching this video from the Lotus Eaters podcast, and I was fascinated by it. I learned so many things that I had been confused about. I got clarity on for many years. And so I want to hand it over to Christian real quick to explain this video about the tariff situation, because there are a lot of things here that I didn't expect, and I don't think a lot of commentators are touching on, and I think it's going to bring a lot of clarity to the tariff situation that we don't currently have.
Okay, so as Hamilton was saying, today we're talking a little bit about tariffs. Now, there's a lot of people that have a lot of different positions on tariffs. Typically, Nick is against tariffs. Typically, I'm against tariffs. I don't think I've ever found an instance where Nick is in favor of tariffs. I've actually changed my position on this a little bit, in part because of some of the implications related to things like monetary policy and stuff like that. And this video actually kind of articulates the tension that I'm now having to grapple with, because we got a huge problem, and I don't see anybody else really talking about tariffs from the perspective that I now understand kind of where the problem is coming from. I see everybody right now talking about tariffs from the typical theoretical standpoints, free trade good, free trade bad. Oh, this leads to, shutting down factories. Oh, you're going to increase, import inflation.
Don't forget the people that are saying, basically the people who 5 minutes ago were like, I hate tariffs.
That was me 5 minutes ago.
And now they love it because Trump's doing it. And then there's people 5 minutes ago that were like, we need all these tariffs. And now they hate it because Trump's doing it. It's like, so you got like the party divide, but then you've got the parties themselves divided.
Oh, well, yeah. We've even seen Elon publishing videos from Milton Friedman talking about tariffs. And so you've got the divide there with Elon very involved in Doge. And we've been historically anti-tariffs because it ends up being a tax on the citizens and it's anti-free market. So what you're saying, Christian, though, is that now you may have a different opinion on the situation despite our long-term held opinions about economic philosophy, and this might just be different?
Yeah, it just might be different this time. And the reason has nothing to do actually with Trump. I see all these arguments tying Trump into it because obviously, he's the guy that's implementing them. But let's put it like this. We're screwed. We are in huge, enormous trouble right now in terms of like the fiscal health and trajectory of our country.
And Christian's here for it.
It took us all of 3 minutes to go to we're screwed.
He's like, I'm going to black pill everybody. I'm like, please don't black pill everybody. And he's like, I'll try to be mild. And then he's like, oh, we're screwed.
I actually find this quite fascinating.
But we're not screwed for the reasons that we probably think we are.
No. People, I have not heard, I've heard precisely one take that articulates what the problem is from somebody on the internet or on Twitter or YouTube. And it's the guys from this video that we're about to play. But right before I jump into that, I just want to tell, especially our audience that's listening to this, this might be quite a haunting podcast. This might be the most haunting podcast that we've done ever. Once I get into the implications, and then hopefully you'll walk away from this not necessarily. I don't anticipate to like try to change your mind on this issue one way or the other. That's actually not the point of the podcast. I just want to get that clear. The point of this podcast is not to tell you tariffs are good or tariffs are bad. It's to tell you this is the real reason that tariffs are starting to be implemented. Nobody is talking about this. I mean,
even Trump and how he is
not even Trump is
about
talking
this.
about this. But
is it possible that the reason Trump is giving for why these tariffs he's doing this is not the actual reason?
No, it's not just possible. It's likely.
Likely, okay.
He's not giving the real reason. And again, we'll explain right now. So with all the caveats aside, hopefully this will be a very interesting discussion. We're going to be partially reacting to a video that the Lotus Eaters podcast put out. Lotus Eaters podcast is owned by Carl Benjamin, formerly known as Sargon of Akkad. He has his own show over in the UK and his team of folks that his equivalent of Christian Hines and Tina Freitas and Nick Hamilton sometimes do their own little bits. And they did this segment the other day where they talked about tariffs. And it was kind of long. It's about 30 minutes long. And I'm not going to play the entire thing, but I'm going to play bits and pieces of it because there's one gentleman from the show that just really articulated what's actually happening. And once you watch this, I think you'll get an understanding of why tariffs are being implemented. And again, it has really nothing to do with the typical generic arguments for or against tariffs. This is not Alexander Hamilton here. It's a lot bigger of a problem than, we need to ship jobs back into the U.S. It has to do a lot with fiscal and monetary policy. So
Christian has set this up now and said that we're all screwed, but
Do you have enough protein in your life? The answer is probably no, but I've got good news because Good Ranchers can solve that problem for you. In fact, you can not only get the most delicious beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood you've probably ever had in your life, you can also enjoy the peace of mind with meat-free from hidden additives, antibiotics, and hormones. In fact, if you visit goodranchers.com and use promo code NICK, you're going to get $40 off plus free bacon, ground beef, seed oil-free chicken nuggets, or salmon in every order with your subscription. That's just a great deal. And I'm telling you, Good Ranchers is not just a good quality product, it is a good quality American company. So if you want to support yourself, if you want to support a great company headed up by a great family, and you'd like to support the show, go over to goodranchers.com, use promo code NICK, get that $40 off, and get that free bacon. Or any of the other stuff you like, or just get all the other stuff and then wrap it in free bacon. It doesn't get any better than that. GoodRanchers.com, promo code NICK. Go check it out.
All right. So with all that said, are you ready to watch
We're
this?
ready. Let's
all right,
hear it.
Cool. Here we go. And we'll probably pause and start again at different points. So let's begin.
So he's basically just taken the tariffs that they're charging the US and halved them and said, here you go.
He's saying that he's doing that.
All right.
Claiming that he's doing that. So, for example, if you get down to the UK, I won't play the UK bit, but the UK gets like a 10% tariff. With things we're not charging him 10%. I mean, we got a 2.5% fee that we charge everybody, and that's about it. And you could try and claim that he's factoring in VAT or something like that, but that's not it either. So he's presenting these, and by the way, I'm on Trump's side on all of this. I'm just saying that the framing that he's giving us is not actually correct. So he's framing it as if those are the charges of American goods going in, and then he's just halving it. That's what he wants you to think. Because this is actually going to be a tax raise on Americans. And again, actually, I do support it, and I'll get into why.
Only if they're buying the foreign stuff, though. Right?
now, Christian, real quick, we can hear their British accents.
Mm-hmm.
If any of our audience members are sitting here like, why do I care what a Brit has to say about this situation? Why should they?
That's a great question, in large part because the UK has a very similar problem to what the US has.
Okay.
And so they're approaching it as foreigners from another country, but they're also going to talk about how, we kind of have a bit of the same problem. Now, different mechanisms have created the problem in a different way in the UK, but they have the same problem. And the fact that the UK is getting only a 10% tariff, whereas a country like China or Vietnam is getting a 30, 40, 50, 60% tariff is indicative of that problem.
And it may not be that China gets a higher tariff because they aren't as much of an ally.
That's part of it, but you have to consider, okay, well, is Cambodia an enemy of the United States? Now, they might not be an ally, but like, are they a geopolitical rival,
Sure.
right? Are they trying to displace the U.S. as the global superpower? No, it's Cambodia. And yet they got almost a 50% tariff, whereas the UK got a 10% tariff. And if that was the case, then why have other countries like Canada gotten significantly higher tariffs than somebody like the UK?
So that it is for some other reason than they are not an ally.
Yeah, and he talks about this. He's like, this is not Keir Starmer's genius negotiating abilities. There's a reason the UK is quote unquote only getting a 10% tariff. But what he's trying to get across is that Trump is saying we charge them 10%, that's actually not true. The UK charges relatively few tariffs on allies like the United States. It's, as he pointed out, it's like a 2.2% tariff. And that's kind of like a universal charge that they put on everybody. And so Trump is coming up with these numbers in a different way than how the media is necessarily reporting about this. The figures that he's coming up with are very specific for a reason. And it has to do with...
Oh, don't give it away just yet.
Okay.
Well, let's
okay.
keep watching the video.
All right.
Yeah, but I mean, tariffs are paid by the country that they arrive in. So, you can't, I mean,
That's him pointing out that it's a tax, right? It's paid by the
Yeah.
country that's coming in. So he's admitting that a tariff is a tax. He's not lying about that,
And
right?
I don't think that I think people know that they're the ones who are paying the tariff. But it's something they're willing to deal with because it's sort of a voluntary tax. You don't have to buy what they're selling. You could buy something else. And like you can engage with it if you want to or not. And whenever you've got, I'll never forget in California they were talking about doing a cigarette tax. And that cigarette tax it's basically a bad behavior tax.
Yeah, it's a sin tax.
Yeah.
It's a sin tax. And they totally justified it by being like, well, you don't have to smoke. And the whole reason they implemented that tax is to discourage people from it. The reason we were against that is because if the government gets used to a certain tax and then that tax goes away because it eliminates itself, they're going to look for another way to tax with that money.
And it can also create a black market too.
Right. Well, or a gray market. Yeah. And so in this situation, I do feel like people recognize that taxes are being paid by the consumer.
Yes. Yes.
Or tariffs are being paid by the consumer.
Even the left is recognizing that.
Yeah. Well, they only recognize it when it suits them.
Right.
All right. We got a lot of this that we got to go through. So hopefully we'll start and stop.
Sorry.
No, that was my fault because I stopped it originally. So you don't have anything to apologize for.
you can't tax
so
somebody in Vietnam.
with tariffs, just to clarify for me, if you are an importer, when you import those goods, you pay the people who are exporting it, and then the tariffs you pay on top of that.
Well, no, you pay a duty when you receive something in.
Yeah.
You'll be charged a levy on that.
If you just buy an American car instead of a European Union car or a Japanese car, then
Yeah, there won't be any tariff.
right. And isn't that the whole point?
But wouldn't the cost?
Yes.
Wouldn't the costs come back if the materials that have been used to build that car have been imported themselves and they have the tariffs on top of them? So that would extend the cost as well.
Yeah, that would push up the cost, but still you want to be doing the value add bit in America. So you want to do as much in America as you can. Well, if you're American, you
And
can
the whole point of protectionism is to encourage domestic manufacture, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean that's it. I mean, you two have nailed it straight away. This is something the entire commentariat cannot get their head around. What's going on here? And essentially what it is because America is in a completely unsustainable position, and they just can't kick the can down the road forever. Now I'm going to give you one line because there's lots. It was like 50 minutes long, this thing, and it's mostly him telling us how great he is and how everybody loves him, which is fair enough. I mean, he is Trump. But there was one key line at the end, so I'll read that. If you want your tariff rate to be zero, then build your product right here in America, because there is no tariff if you build the plant, your product in America, Trump said. And that's how he signed off the end.
Offshore to
When I first heard that, I was disappointed.
Yeah.
Because I was hoping that if we placed these tariffs on the other countries and they removed their tariffs, we would remove our tariffs and that we would have a free market.
And
So I was disappointed by this initially.
I don't. So here's one big revelation that I got out of not really watching this, but more piecing together a bunch of different data points, is that I'm not convinced at all that Trump is using this as a negotiating tool. So Nick has brought this up on the podcast several times. He's like, I understand tariffs as a negotiating tool. I raise tariffs on you. You do the thing that I want. Many cases, it could be lowering trade barriers from me, and then I eliminate the tariff, and then we can all enjoy free trade, right? You're seeing a bunch of countries right now that came out immediately after April 2nd when Trump announced all of these sweeping tariffs on literally the entire world, basically. You saw Japan, Vietnam, Canada, the UK, China, Cambodia, Zimbabwe, Argentina, all of them came out and more. And we're like, let's work out a deal. Taiwan was another one. Let's work out a deal. Let's eliminate all trade barriers. Israel did the same thing. They eliminated all their trade barriers with the U.S. And the United States has done nothing in response. Trump's White House has said these are not a negotiating tool. They're not going away.
Well, that's true. But I still
Now they might to a degree
I still
to go away,
understand it as a tool. It may not be to negotiate to get back to zero, because clearly Trump doesn't think tariffs are bad. As a general rule. So if you're coming from the perspective of tariffs are bad, then you can make allowances for, let's use this as a negotiating tool. Well, he's still using it as a tool, just not a negotiating tool. He's using it as a tool to get factories and things like that to come back, because he wants to get more Americans employed. He wants all of that money and all of that productivity to come back to the U.S. so then it can be exported from us instead of being exported or imported.
But then I was even more disappointed, because we've talked at great length on this podcast about competitive advantage, and that the U.S. may not be in the most competitive position to create certain products and services. But there might be another reason for these tariffs that are beyond that.
Yeah, so a principle that Nick brings up, I'm going to try as many times as I can to bring up Nick's position, because a lot of what I'm going to say in this podcast, Nick is very likely to disagree with, potentially strongly. So I don't want to like straw man the position, because I believed in that position until about 5 minutes ago. You could argue that that's a ding against me, but the reason that I changed is because I got new data. And I pieced together that we're not actually in a free market, not even close to a free market. And this isn't about competitive or comparative advantage, because we are hamstringing ourselves by the global monetary system. That is the reason that we're not producing all these things here in the U.S. It's not because we have this idea that it's because, well, it's just too expensive now to make things in the U.S.
Well, the other thing that Nick usually will say is,
and it is, but not for the reasons that people think.
But expense isn't even necessarily his reasoning. His reasoning is societies sort of, I'm going to use the word evolve or progress past certain things. So we no longer have certain types of huge factories and things like that, because Americans expect higher wages than what you could get,
and that's the
doing
typical,
some of these things. Now, obviously, we can just automate, but his whole thing was, well, let other developing countries do this work that we've kind of progressed past. And just because we're not producing this item anymore doesn't mean it's because we're on to bigger and better things. And I would agree with that if I thought that was the only thing at play, but it's not. We've got onerous regulations. It's very expensive to do business here. And so those are all things that are going to have to be adjusted. If we're bringing everything back here, we're going to have to adjust those things and make doing business in the U.S. profitable for people again. And that that means we get rid of the onerous regulations. We get rid of just ridiculous taxes. And there's a lot of things we will have to get rid of in order to make it worth their while, even with tariffs.
I definitely don't disagree, but that is not the reason that we don't have all these factories in the U.S. I think that that's actually a myth, that we don't have factories in the U.S. anymore, and we do. Let's be clear, we do still have manufacturing
certain ones
in the
we
U.S.
don't have anymore, but it's
reason,
not necessarily because we've progressed. It's more because doing business here is just.
But it's not, Tina, it's not taxes and regulations, because if that was the case, why does Germany have such a large manufacturing base? They're more regulated and more heavily taxed. They're more socialist than we are. Japan is a heavy export-centric, manufacturing-centric economy. And it's not because they're being paid $1 a day, right? It's not because, they just accept lower wages. Japan's a first world fully developed economy. So is Germany, right? These are countries with standards of living that are basically, at least until recently, on par with the U.S., and yet they had manufacturing-centric, export-centric economies with strong industrial bases. They didn't go through deindustrialization like we did, right? They didn't shut down. Now they are. Germany's shutting down all their factories now.
So tell me what makes
we're going to get to that in a few
yeah,
minutes.
We're going to get to that. Don't worry.
It's fascinating. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay.
To us.
Yeah, bring it back. Bring it back. That's what he's saying. Now, let me just build up on my point about how the current situation is unsustainable. Because the entire commentariat, even right-wing commentariat, are coming at this from the line of, this is a variation of where we are now, and it put costs up against where we are now, and therefore it is a bad thing. Right, but here's the problem. Where we are now is mental. So this is the US debt clock.
I think I'm having a stroke looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, it is a bit busy, but I'll point out the key areas. So the US national debt, it's like 37 trillion. That's insane. How did we get to a position like that? Okay, so the US spends...
That's about 100 grand every 5 seconds it's going up.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. Well, a bit less than that, I think. No, a bit faster than that. So the US is spending 7 trillion every year, and it's collecting in taxes 5 trillion every year. So, and in fact, I'll quickly go to the world level that just gives you the quick balance. Right, so the US debt and its GDP is about the same thing. Now, that's actually quite helpful when the two numbers are the same, because then you simply need to ask one question: which is growing faster? The debt is growing faster, and therefore the debt will consume everything if this isn't stopped. So the current situation that the US is in is insane. This has to be stopped. As you can see here, the US does not have a tax raising problem as such. It has a spending problem. But all the time it's got that enormous 2 trillion deficit, it is just unwinding the roots of the country. So that has to be turned around quickly.
Okay, so I mean, we've talked about this at length, right? That we're going utterly bankrupt. People have discussed like, oh, the American economy is so large. Well, it's all fueled by borrowing, by debt issuance, by money by money printing. For example, I wrote this last night actually when I was planning the outline for this podcast. In 2000, here I'll pull it up so that way people can read it.
It is kind of crazy. There's so many people upset about cuts being made and what they're doing, with Doge and everything. And the left is just losing their mind over it. But it's like they're living in this alternate reality where they don't understand. This whole thing like makes no sense to them. The idea that this is completely unsustainable. We can't do this, and
it's
have to do something.
It's more unsustainable than even Republicans realize. So
right,
listen.
But Republicans and Democrats alike are kind of like, oh, I didn't know we were going to cut this or we were going to cut that, and it's like, you guys, we have so many unfunded mandates. Things have to be cut, even where it hurts.
So, listen to this. In 2008, the U.S. GDP was 14.77 trillion. It's gone from that to 30.33 trillion today. During that same exact time period, the national debt has gone from 9.98 trillion to 36.69 trillion. So I ran all the numbers. That is a 267% increase in the debt, 26.71 trillion during that same time period, compared to a 105% increase in GDP, 15.56 trillion. So what that basically means is that all economic growth over the last 17 years is fake. All of it is fake. The debt is growing faster than the economy is. The only reason, if you subtract the two, you could argue that the real economy has actually shrunk since 2008 because it is entirely funded by new debt that is growing faster than wages and faster than the entire American economy. The federal budget deficit and the federal debt that it's piling into is growing faster than the entire American economy. And keep in mind that GDP number is inflated already because the government is spending money that fuels GDP growth.
Printed money.
Right? Like when the government is spending money on
basically
aircraft
fake
carriers.
GDP. It's basically the government is buying from itself.
Well, no. It's not that it's not that the GDP is fake. There's elements of the GDP that's real, right? But what I'm saying is there's also elements of GDP that's fake in the sense that it's fueled by government spending.
Right,
So
that's what I mean.
So like when the Navy gets a new aircraft carrier that's made out of Newport News here in Virginia, that fuels GDP growth, right? Because it's like, oh, this money's going into Huntington Ingalls, the shipyard, and it's fueling all these jobs and it's creating all this steel work and stuff like that. Like that goes into the GDP figure. But if it wasn't for the fact that we have basically $1 trillion Pentagon, we wouldn't need if we weren't a global superpower, we wouldn't need these aircraft carriers.
Well, the government can buy these things with printed money at its full value because it prints the money. And so it can buy these things and be like, oh, look at all the jobs we created. Oh, look at the stuff we did.
Mm-hmm.
And it really isn't it's not real as far as, yes, it's productive, but it's not sustainable because the money that bought it is being printed. It's not actually out in circulation where it came in, and it's not done in the normal fashion. That's why I feel like GDP should be broken up in 2 separate sections. We should have government spending separate from our actual GDP.
Private.
Because
There
I want
are
to know what
figures that-
private people are producing and what that number looks like.
There are competing figures that are less popular that try to measure stuff absent of government spending. But the point of these numbers that I'm trying to get across, and that this gentleman from the Lotus Eaters podcast was discussing, is that the economy is only growing right now because new debt is being issued to fuel the growth of that economy. We have not actually grown in 17 years. And, this is actually quite similar to what's happened in Europe. The UK, their economy hasn't grown since the financial crash in 2008. The European Union, they haven't grown since 2008. We've doubled. But the only reason we've doubled is because we've more than doubled, we've almost tripled the debt in that same time period. And so we're kind of breaking away from them, right? We're leaving them in the dust on paper. It looks like that America is just running roughshod over the rest of the world. And, we're growing by leaps and bounds and the rest of the world is stagnating. And so, oh, look at this American economic miracle. All these Euro poors across the Atlantic are dealing with, sluggish economic growth and lower standards of living. And meanwhile, we're doing great. We're only doing great because we're borrowing money to fuel a lifestyle and a standard of living that we otherwise would be incapable of doing if we weren't borrowing 3 or 2 times the rate that the actual rest of the economy is growing.
It's like the family that has all kinds of luxuries and it looks like they're doing great, but really they're racking up massive amounts of credit card debt and their mortgage they could barely even pay, and they're already like in the rears on certain things. I mean, when people live like a really extravagant lifestyle and then they end up filing Chapter 11, that's basically where our government's at, but amped up to massive levels.
So on that front, and I'll leave you with this question that you need to ask as we go through the rest of this video. Think about for a minute why and how the United States has been able to grow its economy over the last 17 years and the European Union and the UK haven't. I just said that it's all fueled by money printing and debt issuance. Well, why haven't they done the same thing that we've done to keep the economy growing, quote unquote?
Haven't they done it to a degree though? Like, don't they have debt as well?
They do have tons of debt, but we have way more.
But it's because we are the reserve currency, right?
We're able to get away with it and they can't because nobody's trading. I mean, people do trade in euros, but people trade in dollars way more than euros. Same thing with pounds. The pound hasn't been the reserve currency in 100 years since the end of World War I. And so there's just simply less liquidity in the sense that there's less demand for pounds than dollars. And so, yeah, the British can run a huge budget deficit, but they can't run one as large as we can because there's not as many buyers of British debt as there is, as there are of American debt. So just keep that in mind as we go through the rest of this, because this is going to be related to the tariff situation.
So, Christian, before we get into this video again, I want to bring up a question that our friend Andrew said or asked in the chat. And just keep in mind, folks, if you want to be able to help us drive the direction of the show and propose questions during the live recording, you can become a member of the IC Today at the link in the description. We have quite a few folks in here right now. We've got a live chat going. We're getting people's feedback. We're getting your questions and feedback, and you are helping us design the show and future episodes. So go down to the link in the description. Sign up to be a member of the IC Today. It's very cheap, and you get to watch every podcast that we record before anybody else. So, Christian, I'm going to ask this question from Andrew. He says, can you really call it a free trade environment with the U.S. as the global reserve currency?
No, you can't, which is part of the reason why I begrudgingly support tariffs in this particular instance. In any other instance, I would be opposed to tariffs. Like if we had a gold standard or a Bitcoin standard, or if this was, pre-Bretton Woods, or certainly pre 1971 Nixon shock, I'd of course be against tariffs for the same reason that we've articulated many times on this podcast. But we don't actually we can't have a free trade system because of the way the monetary system is set up. And again, I'll get into a little bit more detail on that later in the podcast.
Well, let's keep going through this video.
Okay.
So when you hear about how mad it is, just remember that, no, where we are starting from is the mad bit. The US needs to cut its spending, and that's what Doge is all about. And it's going to have to raise a bit of revenue in the meantime as well, because it's got to get that down. It can bring in future tax cuts in the future, and I think that's what's going to happen.
Do we know where most of that spending is coming from? Because I've recently started reading Super Imperialism by Michael Hudson, and in the introduction to that, he talks about how in the 1970s, when he originally wrote it, he'd done some kind of revenue check of how the US was spending its money and found that basically the entirety of the deficit was going off into international military spending. So military bases, wars being fought. Obviously, it was the time of Vietnam as well, but a lot of people would put it down to the military-industrial complex. Is that still the case?
I can answer that question, actually. Yeah, Samson, if you put it back on screen. So basically, it's transfers to boomers, people who don't want to work, blowing stuff up and paying debt. So, first one there,
oh my gosh, I loved that so much just now.
That's where all the money's going.
It gets better.
It's
Just
going
wait.
to boomers, people who don't want to work, and blowing stuff up.
And interest on the debt.
And interest on the debt. All these unfunded mandates, too.
That's where all the money's going. It gets better, though, as Hamilton said. Don't worry.
Medicare, Medicaid, that takes up $1.5 trillion. Social Security, that's another $1.5 trillion. Defense is another trillion, basically. I think it's much bigger than that number once you factor in all the intelligence services stuff as well. But it's probably closer to another 1.5 rather than just under one. And then debt, interest that they've got to pay. And that's mental because, at least with that, you've got happy boomers. At least with that, you've got people in inner cities waddling around getting corn syrup stuffed down their throat, not having to work. So at least you're getting something. And at least with that, you get to watch a pretty explosion.
He's pointing at the defense budget.
So he's pointing out that, well, at least with these things, you get happy boomers, you get, people on welfare that are happy, and you get to watch things get blown up. But then this last one, interest on the debt, that's just money that's just being evaporated.
I got to say this. The only legitimate thing we are paying for out of that list there is our military. That is the federal government's job, is to defend our nation, right? None of those other things are functions of government or are supposed to be.
Now, Sunday night, Christian gave me a education on the interest on the debt and how that's paid, why it's paid. And I learned that the Treasury sells bonds. Is that correct?
Yep.
Bonds to anyone. It could be China. I could buy a bond. Christian could buy a bond. Any country could buy a bond.
Corporations can buy bonds.
And then when we buy that bond, we buy them at a specific interest rate. And then when we hold that bond, we give the government the money, and then we get paid an interest rate on that. And so I thought, in my not knowing what's going on about debt and lack of understanding, I thought, China, gives us this money, and then we're in debt to them, but they do that through treasuries.
Mm-hmm.
And then I learned a whole bunch of other stuff about interest rates and why the Federal Reserve changing interest rates changes mortgage rates because I want to buy a house and all this stuff. But $1 trillion just on the interest of those treasury bonds.
Yep.
That are paid out to anyone.
It's paid out to everybody who owns a treasury bond.
That's crazy. $1 trillion just on the interest.
Every single year. That's more than the Pentagon's entire defense budget. And eventually it'll eclipse, in the near future, it'll eclipse Social Security payments. Eventually it'll eclipse everything.
And there's not an infinite number of treasury bonds, right?
No, but there will be.
They have to issue them.
They have to issue them, but there will be an infinite number. That's the whole.
But then the interest is paid with what?
It's paid with more treasury bonds. Because we're running a deficit, a perpetual deficit.
But if I owned a bond and the treasury pays me that interest, how are they getting the money to pay me?
They're issuing another bond to pay you.
Oh.
That's why I said we're screwed, Hamilton.
But are they, when they issue another bond and then sell that bond and then use that money to pay me, the bond is printed money?
Not always. It can be. If the Federal Reserve is the one that buys the bonds, it's always printed money.
Doesn't
because
the
that's where the
bond
Fed
basically
gets the money
represent the printed money, though?
In a way, it represents an IOU that
IOUs. We love those.
Going to be paid with another IOU. When the Fed buys bonds, and they do at times, this is called debt monetization, which we've also talked about on this show. when the Fed buys bonds, it's direct printed money. The Fed prints money. They go to the Treasury Department. They buy however many bonds they want to buy. And suddenly, Congress now has all the money in the world that they want to spend on gender programs in Pakistan or redistribution programs to boomers.
Meanwhile, if you own a bond, they just deflated what you own. So it's basically
No, they're deflating no matter what. Or sorry, it's not deflating. They're inflating no matter what.
What I mean, I guess I shouldn't say deflating. They are devaluing what you own in order to take the full value of all this magic money that was just printed, right?
It doesn't matter how they're issuing the bond. It doesn't matter if the Fed's buying it by printing money, or it doesn't matter if China buys it, which, by the way, they're not buying them anymore. They're selling them. It doesn't matter if Japan, if Saudi Arabia, if, corporate America buys them. It doesn't matter who buys them. It's all being funded with more debt issuance because we're running a perpetual budget deficit every single year. So when they're paying that $1 trillion in interest, well, we're running a $2 trillion deficit. And so what's happening inevitably is that every time a bond comes due and it's paid off, it's being paid off with another bond that's actually more than another bond, a little bit more than a previous bond. So I'm not giving you an exact number here, just to understand that. But every time that a bond is paid off, it's almost like a bond and a half is being issued to pay off one previous bond.
Yeah. Okay, sorry to take us down this side trail, but wanted to share with you things that I'm learning.
You just start looking at how many different areas are. It's just like a fake structure.
Yeah.
And a light breeze should blow it down.
It should, and that's why, again, we're going to get into basically how this is creating a huge problem that must be fixed, or else it's going to destroy the entire country. So let's continue.
Yes.
I mean, this is the cost of empire.
Fair enough. But this bit, that debt interest, that's just $1 trillion that is just going up in smoke. That's just the bill coming due on all the rampant spending of the past few decades. Right. So this
so annoying when you get an overdraft. You get charged for using your overdraft.
Yeah.
Or when you look at the interest on your own mortgage.
Yeah.
So,
And won't that be? Will that be interest that they need to repay to their own banks?
Oh, all over the place. Some of it will be their own citizens' pension funds. Some of it will be China. Some of it will be, the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi. It'd be going all over the place. That money. But anyway, so this situation cannot stand. This has to change. But the thing is, he can't just come out and say, I'm going to. It's two things he's achieving. Partly, it's a bit of a tax increase. But he can't come out and say, I'm raising taxes on American. Although all his critics are going to make that claim, so I need to address it. But actually, it's more about reorientating stuff. America doesn't need cheap Chinese tat. What America needs is homes and jobs. And that is what he's actually trying to change. In fact, I'll show you. Here we go. We've got the actual tariffs. Interestingly, it appears that it's being derived from a simple Excel formula rather than what he's claiming, which is reciprocal tariffs. I will come to that in a second.
Still, it's interesting that if those numbers, the numbers saying what the other countries are charging the United States, if they're even remotely true or close, that's remarkable to me. Because look at it. I mean, it's sort of mad. You talk about free trade, or Donald Trump's the enemy of free trade. Well, wait a minute. What about everyone else in the whole world?
It's saying tariffs charged, including currency manipulation, trade barriers. So
it's not really that. I mean, a lot of these countries do have effective tariffs against the United States, so it's not completely wrong, but it's not really right either.
I mean, if you look at some of the big ones there, like Vietnam's massive, or Cambodia, or Myanmar, saw on there, Madagascar. I mean, or Laos.
Yeah,
it's funny actually with the Vietnam War.
Madagascar,
not Madagascar.
Madagascar, a big threat of importing American goods.
Well, exactly. This is what I was going to say. I mean, what is Vietnam and Madagascar importing from the United States? Now, it's all worked out on physical goods, which is key. It is not including
commodities,
services.
Right. Okay.
Right. So, if you are a Lotus Eaters subscription holder, don't be worried. You're probably not going to get tariffed for watching the Lotus Eaters. Although the Islander probably will get.
I was just going to say, what about the island?
Yeah. but at least the UK is down at 10% because we also have a fantasy economy. I'll be coming to that. Right, and actually on the point of how these were worked out, some guy figured it out. So basically what they're doing is they're taking the trade deficit divided by the exports, leaving out services.
Okay, so that's quite low resolution anyway, you cut it then.
Yeah, but essentially what it's doing is people who send us real stuff, if we're not sending them an equal amount of real stuff back, they're getting a bigger tariff. And that kind of explains why Vietnam the rate is so high and why China the rate is so high is because those countries are actually doing real things.
Manufacturing.
Well, or I mean, in Vietnam, I don't know how much it's manufacturing. It's probably sewing a lot of T-shirts and stuff like that. A lot of garments are probably being made there. But nevertheless, it is a real thing. That's getting shipped over to America, and America, of course, doesn't send much to Vietnam. Thus the huge imbalance.
Do you get where this is going? Now, that was a long clip that we played, but the reason this chart shows all these different numbers where it's like massive numbers from Bangladesh or Vietnam or China and tiny numbers for the UK is because the UK doesn't really actually ship us a whole lot of stuff, but Vietnam does. And so Trump is saying, well, we're putting in reciprocal tariffs against them because they're charging us. He's coming to that conclusion by looking at the trade deficit. He's not actually coming to that conclusion by looking at actual hard tariff numbers. He's looking at which countries in the world are making the most money off of shipping goods to the United States. Well, it's China, it's Vietnam, it's Bangladesh, it's all these countries in like Southeast Asia that are manufacturing stuff and they're shipping it to America. It's not the European countries because the European countries don't make anything and they're not sending us anything. They are to some degree, but not nearly to the degree that, you know, again, countries like China or South Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam or Bangladesh do, because those countries actually make stuff. They make cars, they make clothes.
Yeah, but they make crap.
Yes, but
I feel like
it doesn't matter though.
I feel like in textiles, the quality of textiles has completely plummeted over the past couple of decades. You cannot, if you feel a shirt now versus a shirt from the past, they're two totally different things.
Tina, I don't disagree, but the point is more who's sending us stuff, not what's the quality of the stuff. China is sending us stuff. The UK doesn't really send us a whole lot of stuff in terms of significantly more than what we're sending them. We both do trade with each other, but China does way more trade with us than we do with them. And so Trump's numbers, his percentages that he's coming up with on that giant billboard that he came out with on, you know, in front of the White House, he's calculating those numbers by how much more stuff are they sending us than we're sending them.
Right.
And that's how he's getting those percentages.
To tee up where we're going, I think another way of putting this is Trump is looking at which countries are the most productive.
Yes.
And I think what we're about to learn is that these tariffs are not an effort for protectionism necessarily, but in an effort to increase the productivity of the United States.
And for us to stop heading towards bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, let's keep going.
So effectively, the way you've got to think about this is he is going after real things. He wants to rebalance real things being moved into the United States and real work being done in the United States. And the criticism of all of this is that you're going to push up costs, you're going to push up taxes and stuff, and you're going to damage the economy. Now, yes, he is going to damage the economy, right? But let's get to the sort of big takeaway here.
This is really important.
Good.
This is probably the most important part of this entire video.
Because what is the real... I'm going to show you what the real US economy looks like. Can we play this video?
My coworkers keep saying I need to make it like a TikTok, because if you look at my TikTok, you never guess I have a job. So anyways, this is our current workstation. Callie and I are what you call product managers. Callie, what is your team over?
My team is over reporting and internal tools.
And I am over what we call card experience. So we work on like anything from activating your credit card to freezing, reissue, shipping, all the good stuff. What's a PM?
We help prioritize and help the engineers stay on track and help them know what to build so that you have product to use.
Yeah, exactly. So you might have a team like the engineers actually do the developing, the coding, which is the impressive part. Designers also do the impressive part.
Right, okay, you get the point.
You know when a little kid, a small child, like a 5 or 6 year old, starts parroting adults and obviously don't know what they're saying, or perhaps a foreign language actor doing Shakespeare and they're just reading the line, they're saying the words, but they obviously have got no idea what they're saying or what they're talking about. That was the impression I got about these two young ladies.
I was thinking more like when a small child wants to help you do some DIY housework, and they obviously can't actually do anything. So you give them, say, a nut and a screw, and you say, solve this for me. And they go off in the corner and they think that they're helping, but you're just getting them out of the way.
So that, right, except we in the Western world,
20-year-old women.
Yes, have created an entire society and an economy that made up work for women has become the economy. Right. So she's probably getting paid 60, 70, maybe 80K a year.
I mean, do you remember those TikToks from a few years ago of my life, a day in the life of a Chicago tech worker? And it's just girls going for brunch with their friends.
Yeah.
They sit down for half an hour, answer a few emails, and then they go and play pool for the rest of the evening and get drunk.
This is entirely my big point. Yes, when the lefties say that these tariffs are going to damage the US economy, yes, it will damage the US economy, but that's because the US economy is not entirely, but largely absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
Tina, what is your reaction to what was just said?
Like nail on the head. That's for sure. I mean, there are so many. It reminds me of all these women that were like, "We don't need a man," da da da, and I make my own money. And you kind of look at this and go, "Well, you're actually making nothing. You're not doing anything of any real value. There is nothing you're producing and providing to others at all." So. And meanwhile, the men are out still making sure your electrical grid works, and they're creating and building the things that we need. Now, this obviously isn't a men versus women's podcast, but it is really interesting to me that, like, these girls are basically on a perpetual vacation where they answer a few emails once in a while. But honestly, that's also how our government has been working.
Yeah.
We have people that have been showing up to office maybe once or twice a week to do what? And then these huge office buildings are a quarter are in use and the rest are empty. You know, it's wild to me, and yet we're going to.
And the government's not productive as it is. Even if the interesting thing is, even if those buildings were fully staffed, those jobs would still be worthless.
It wouldn't matter because all they're doing is shuffling paper around and doing
and actually stifling real economic growth.
It's not
usually.
real work. It's not. It's not real work.
You got it immediately. But there's so many of these people on the internet that are like, I'm a Reagan conservative. I'm a Republican, and I oppose Trump's tariffs because I believe in free trade. You're saying that you believe in free trade, but what you're actually defending is the perpetuation of the fake economy that we have. And we have a fake economy because we're living above our means. How? How do I know this? Because we're importing trillions of dollars worth of goods every year, and we're not exporting anything. And so what we have is imagine a family that's incredibly wealthy, right? They're the Waltons, right? Or the Rockefellers or something like that. But they start living above even their means, which is crazy at first, right? Because they're multi-billionaires. And they spend and they spend and they spend and they spend. And then they start taking out credit cards and they spend and they spend and they spend and they spend. And for a long time, you can keep living a lifestyle that's even larger than you would normally if you just lived within your means as a multi-billionaire. But now they're living like a trillionaire's lifestyle, right? They're living like they're running a whole country. But eventually they run out of money. And then the whole thing collapses. And then it's suddenly revealed that, oh, they're not even billionaires anymore. They're not even millionaires anymore. They're actually totally bankrupt. They're totally broke.
Now they're
and
fully
then the
in the
repo
red.
men come.
That's more than just being broke.
Yeah.
You're in the red.
And then the repo men come and they confiscate their mansions and their cars and they lose everything. And that's what's happening to our country right now, is that we are living above our means, and we have these fake jobs, fake email jobs, fake government jobs, fake NGO jobs, fake university jobs, and everybody's teaching queer theory and DEI and ESG. None of this stuff actually makes anything of value. None of the email jobs, none of the NGO jobs, none of the university jobs, none of the federal bureaucracy jobs, none of the fake email jobs, none of the tech workers in Chicago or Silicon Valley.
The education jobs and the jobs in higher ed, they are producing something. It's just not good for our country.
No, they're producing something of negative value.
Yeah.
I unfortunately have to leave in just a moment to go speak with one of our partners, but I want to make this quick point. I've been watching a lot of videos recently on the crisis of dating that we have right now. Give me one. And it all comes, what's being talked about right now is women's ability to earn has increased greatly. What that has also done is increase their desire for their partner's ability to earn. And if you think about this situation and the fake economy, it is the fake economy that has led to women making more money, which is not a bad, I'm not saying that's inherently a bad thing, but has also led to their increased desire for a man that makes more money than them, when men have, in large part, stayed within the productive sectors of the economy. And the dating crisis, one might point to, is being fueled by the fake economy.
Yeah.
That's a huge part of the reason, Hamilton. I hope that I'm gonna do my best to filibuster as long as possible for Hamilton to come back from his business call. Don't worry, we've got plenty of stuff to go.
I will
to
be
still
back
go
as
through.
soon as I can. I apologize, guys.
But no, Hamilton's right on, because you still have a. Don't get me wrong. The United States does make stuff. We have factories. We have manufacturing. We have real creativity. Like, we haven't lost that entirely. We do make stuff. The problem is that we don't make nearly as much as what we consume. And so we filled the gap by importing stuff from the rest of the world. Now, normally, so if Nick was sitting across the table, he'd be like, well, that's not a bad thing, because, you know, other countries might make things that we don't make, and we might make things that they don't make. He's not wrong on that. You have comparative advantage. And the analogy that he comes up with is, well, you know, I run a, I'm just throwing out a company, right? You know, I run a huge trade imbalance with Chick-fil-A. Nate knows this, our producer over there in the corner, because usually when we're done with the podcast, I go and run. In fact, actually, Nate, you want Chick-fil-A at the end of the today's podcast? I might go get some. Point is that, like, you know, I run a huge trade imbalance with Chick-fil-A. I eat there like at least once or twice a week, and they don't really buy anything from me. And so surely that's a bad thing, right? We need to correct that imbalance. Well, no, in that case, it makes perfect sense, because they have something I want, and so I buy it from them. But the problem is when you scale that up to countries and you fuel a trade imbalance, not by actual ability, because here's the thing, I have an actual ability to pay for what I'm buying from Chick-fil-A. I'm not putting it on a credit card. I'm taking it from my money that I make to buy Chick-fil-A. But what we have is, no, we're spending money that we don't have on imports from the rest of the world to fuel a lifestyle that disproportionately benefits probably like the top 10% of society that are working these type of fake jobs where they're getting paid enormous sums of money to press some buttons on a keyboard and send some emails every single day, but they're not actually making anything of value. They're only making stuff of value, and the market says that it's valuable because the market's fake too. It's all fueled by money printing. It's all fueled by debt issuance. If we stopped printing money tomorrow and we immediately balanced the federal budget tomorrow, what would we have to do? We would have to almost completely eliminate Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of the money that we spend on, you know, things like USAID, all the grants, all the ESG, all the DEI.
And that's the thing,
all that
is
stuff would have to go away immediately.
The left knows that the first couple of things that you mentioned are their sacred cow. And they're actually the sacred cow of everyone who's staring down the barrel of retirement. I have seen absolute strong Republicans become extremely liberal in their thinking when it comes to Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. It's, you can't tell them, hey, this system's not working, we need to figure something else out, because they've been paying into it forever, and they've paid in, they've been promised something, and they want what they were promised. Totally understand it, but it's a horrible system. And the left knows that they know we'll never get rid of Social Security or Medicaid. And so what they do is they attach everything to that, because it's the sacred cow. And anytime there's even when we're trying to find fraud, waste, and abuse, they're like, you're cutting Medicaid.
Yep.
You're cutting
Remember the
Social
protest
Security.
from just a few days ago? You had all of the country. You had liberals that were holding up, hands off. First off, I find that really ironic that the people that spent the last 10 years shoving their ideology down the throats of the American people have the gall to tell anybody hands off about anything.
Right.
Right? You don't believe in hands off at all. You don't believe in live and let live at all. That's the whole reason we got to this point. That's the whole reason we got to this point, is because you did not accept the idea of hands off. You said, no, I will force my worldview on you.
Yeah.
Okay, if that's how the game's played, then I guess it's time for us to start reversing the roles, right? But more importantly, in the realm of economics and monetary policy and fiscal policy, what we have right now is a totally unsustainable system that's fueled by debt issuance, fueled by money printing. And where is that money printing and debt issuance going? It eventually trickles its way down into effectively fake jobs that fund an ideology that wouldn't exist otherwise. And guess what? When you look at the left and right today, which one would survive a return to sound money and balanced budgets? Would conservatism die or would wokeism die? Which one benefits from a fake economy fueled by fake money and debt issuance? Well, it's wokeism that does. Wokeism doesn't produce anything of value at all.
No,
and
it only tears things down. And you look at
we know that because look at the institutions that wokeism hijacked. They hijacked the federal bureaucracy, academia, the media, Silicon Valley, Wall Street. How many cars does academia produce? How many homes does the media build? How many shirts and tables and iPhones and computers does the university system or Wall Street keep intact? No, they don't actually produce anything of value. Now, that's not to say that Wall Street doesn't serve a useful function. It does insofar as it facilitates trade of, stocks and stuff like that.
Well, and academia, like the idea is they're supposed to be they're supposed to be producing knowledge, basically. Like they're supposed to be, their service is to transfer knowledge from one person.
But what they're doing is they're transferring an ideology.
But instead, it's all ideology. It's brainwashing, and you can even see this with the left when they comment on certain things. They're like, "Well, we could tell who's uneducated here," and it's like it's not about being educated or uneducated at this point. It's indoctrinated or unindoctrinated.
And just to clarify, because for those that get to this point in the podcast, I'm sure there's going to be a libertarian that's going to be like, "Since when did Christian become a historical materialist like Marxism?" I'm not saying I'm a historical materialist. I'm not saying I'm definitely not. I'm actually an idealist. But no, I'm not saying that the only thing of value is making physical goods like this mug, which, by the way, apparently I think you can buy on our store. We might need to check that because I don't think you can buy this one because this one has my name on it.
You can't buy the Christian one.
The point is that I'm not saying that that's the only thing of value, right? Is the ability to make physical stuff. I think that there's actual immense value in the marketplace of ideas, but you can't have a functioning economy without the ability to make stuff that allows that functioning economy operate. You cannot build an economy off of just BS that's coming out of wokeism from the university system or the media, or you know what I mean? Like you have to have the ability to make certain stuff that people want.
Yeah. And if turns out psychology and all of that is not. It's not very productive. In fact, it could be very damaging.
Yeah. So I want to get through a little bit more of this and then show you some other stuff that I've got. I've got a couple of other links that I've got pulled up here. So let's keep going because believe it or not, it actually kind of gets worse.
Yeah, that's the problem. It is not
about right.
It is not a well-engineered, perfect structure with no faults that must be preserved because of its purity. No, it's an economy run on debt, importing cheap plastic tap from China. You have women working absolute bullshit. Meanwhile, you have good men in large parts of the country hooked on opium and unemployed because there's no real work, no manufacturing, nothing tangible, nothing real. That's the problem. That is what Trump is trying to address. So real economics is happening in Asia. Real stuff is getting done. Bull wankery like this is happening in the West. And basically those high tariffs, as you saw before, they're targeting the real stuff. They're creating an incentive for that real stuff to be sent over and done in America, which is why the UK tariffs are so low. So again, everybody's take on this is wrong. You're going to see some people saying that the low tariff that UK is paying is a Brexit dividend or something like that, or Keir Starmer's cool negotiation handling of Trump. No, it's none of that. It's because our economy is as much bullshit as their economy, and therefore we don't make any real stuff because Asia's doing all of it, and so therefore we get a low tariff rate because we're also a bullshit economy.
Yeah. Sorry for all of the cussing, but
like, don't worry, we'll bleep it all out probably in post. But like, you get the argument that he's making, right? Like, you look at what's happening in the UK, and it's the same thing. They don't make anything as well. It's all fake. It's just not. It's not as large as the fake economy that we have.
Right.
But they're not manufacturing stuff in the UK. They're not making, steel mills. They're shutting down their steel mills. In fact, actually, I read an article the other day that like British Steel is shutting down like their last factory in the UK. It's like 150 years after they were established. The Industrial Revolution began in the UK, and now they're not going to be making any steel of their own in the country that gave birth to the Industrial Revolution. Like, they're not making stuff. They're basically redistributing wealth, and they're manipulating numbers on spreadsheets. And a lot of that wealth is going, where's it going? To DEI, to ESG.
We export woke.
We export woke.
They export woke.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they've adopted it, and they've built their entire economy around woke as well. And so where's the real work being done? It's being done in China. It's being done in Japan. To a degree, it's being done in Germany, being done in South Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, because they're making stuff and they're exporting those things to us. And we pay them in pieces of paper that we printed off a printing press. And so now we have this glorious, luxurious standard of living, right? We have all these things, this laptop that I got probably from China, right? My phone that I definitely got from China. All these lights and cameras, they were probably manufactured in Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, maybe China. Taiwan, Nate says Taiwan. None of the stuff in this room is made in the United States. I'm willing to bet that huge chunks of the house that this was, that we're sitting in right now, wasn't even manufactured in the United States.
Most of the meat that you buy at Walmart's grocery section or whatever is not raised
Good Ranchers
here.
is raised here, right?
Yeah,
but
Good Ranchers is.
You know, so that there's an example of something that's made in the U.S., right? But huge chunks of our economy that we base our standard of living on, all the technical equipment in this studio, is not assembled in the United States. It's not made in the United States. We imported it from the rest of the world. And how did we pay for that? That cost money. Where did we get that money from? Well, we printed it at the Federal Reserve, and then we paid for it by just making it out of thin air. You cannot run an economy around that forever. It's just physically impossible. You can't do it. And so tariffs are an attempt by the Trump administration, whether, anybody in the, whether any influencers online realize it or not, regardless of your position on tariffs. The fact of the matter is that it is an attempt. I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm not saying you have to buy into it. I'm simply trying to explain what's actually happening here. It's an attempt to actually have things made back in the United States, because you cannot run an economy forever on zero industrial base, infinite money printing, and importing everything from abroad. And by the way, selling off everything in the United States to the rest of the world that's left over when it's all said and done. And I'm going to get into that last point later in the podcast. You're going to see something that's going to be truly horrific, truly haunting once you see this. But
Christian's making good on his promise to blackpill everyone. Buckle up, everybody.
We're near the end here of this video, and then I'm going to jump into a couple of these other links, okay?
Yeah, that's what's going on.
The other angle I saw, which I thought was palpably nonsense, I wonder what you're taking on it. It was a picture, a cartoon, drawing, a meme of Trump taking a piss, and the piss is just blowing back into his face.
I didn't see that.
It was just some stupid cartoon on Twitter. And I was like, this is what tariffs are. This is what America's doing to itself by, and I was like, no, that's not right.
In a way,
if Trump wants to increase manufacturing in the United States, then he's not pissing in his own face at all.
Also,
it's a good idea.
Leftists are always in favour of massively hiking taxes on large corporations, except for when all of a sudden it's done in the form of tariffs, which will basically do the same thing, because it's a tax that might encourage large corporations to actually onshore work that could help American people. I mean, rather than just give out free handouts via.
I mean, no taxes really fall on corporations; they always fall on consumers in the end. But I mean, I take your point.
So he gets it, right? I mean, even though he's defending the tariffs, he's pointing out this is a tax hike. I'm not going to lie about that. You cannot say just tax the corporations, because inevitably, even if they don't want to, it will pass its way down to the consumer. Right. Somebody eats it, but ultimately that somebody is you as an individual. And this guy in the middle here, on this Loaders Eaters podcast, he understands all of this stuff, and he's not saying this from like a left-wing perspective or, we need, Bernie Sanders central planning and stuff like that. He's pointing out that just the harsh reality of we're broke. And from his perspective, he in the UK and his teammates there across the Atlantic, they're in the same position as us. They're arguably just in a worse position because they don't have the ability to print money infinitely like we do. But they're also broke, and their economy is also built around nothing. Again, when I say that, though, I don't mean that in the sense that they don't have any productive capacity. They do. But the problem is that they're consuming far more than they're producing. And so they're living a standard of living. That sounds like a contradictory set of terms, but they're enjoying a standard of living that is far greater than what they would normally be able to sustain. And so how are they sustaining it? Through debt. But you can't run that forever.
Mm-hmm.
It's mathematically
impossible. There's a question if I could ask it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Alpha 7 says, you've talked about the potential of the dollar not being the reserve currency of the world much longer. Should we be worried about a central bank / government digital currency taking its place?
Yeah, CBDC, there's a real threat that a CBDC will replace the dollar once the dollar eventually collapses.
What's a CBDC?
Central bank digital currency. That would be effectively everybody banks with the Fed. The Fed just replaces the entire banking system and they become the only bank, essentially.
Wow.
Yes, there's a real danger of that. China has a CBDC, for example, and it is easily... It's not intended necessarily to be that way, but it just immediately becomes a tool for authoritarianism because what it means is that the government runs your bank account, essentially. It's the central bank that you're banking with. But the central bank is an extension of the government, essentially. I know that some people are going to be like, no, it's its own private bank. Look, the Federal Reserve is set up by Congress. The government, if they want to, they can tell the Fed, you're going to do X, and the Fed will do X.
And so if everything's totally digital, if it's all digital, so here's where the side of me that knows like end times type of stuff, where, everyone's like, oh, they're going to do the mark of the beast and all this, right? But there is going to come, the Bible does say there is going to come a time where you will not be able to buy or sell without doing what they want you to do. Like,
I don't really want to get into a huge theological debate.
You don't want to.
Because there's also different interpretations of Revelation.
There is, but I have to touch on this because as soon as people start talking about this type of currency,
yes, I know people bring it up.
People are going to immediately go there in their minds like, oh my gosh, are we all going to have microchips in us or whatever it may be?
I just don't think about that at all because I'm not a dispensationalist, but the point is well taken. And yes, to answer the question, it's a real danger that a CBDC is what could replace the dollar system. And that would just be an even worse version of the current fiat system that we have, because then you get the fiat system plus you get like immediate government tyranny, right? Because the state now has the direct ability to basically tell you what you're allowed to buy because you're banking with the central bank. And so, yeah, there's a real threat there. Now, luckily, Trump's administration has banned any discussion within the federal government about CBDCs. Like that was an executive order that he signed. He's very anti-CBDC. And you're getting states like Florida and Wyoming and a few others that are introducing and passing legislation to say, no, we will not allow a CBDC to operate within our borders. So you're already getting Republicans, particularly at the state level, but even some at the federal level, that are realizing that, no, we cannot allow under any circumstances a CBDC to be what replaces the dollar if the dollar ever goes away. Then you're just restating the problem or restarting the problem, and you're tacking on an additional problem, which is, again, like 1984 style tyranny. So I hope that answers the question. But
yeah, because people were wondering, not like warning us that it's coming. It's what do we do if it does? Like, how should we prepare and be ready?
No, we should fight it, not how to prepare for it. You fight it. Like that's the thing that you fight. You fight to the death against a CBDC, because if you ever get a CBDC, you will lose all your liberties. Like you will live in China. There is no coming out of that system. It's game over permanently, and until that fiat also collapses. But it's game over.
Yeah, I don't know. We have a Second Amendment for that.
Well, that's why I said you
stock up
fight
on guns
that.
and ammo.
You fight a CBDC.
Yeah.
You don't allow it to ever exist, because if it ever exists, it's game over. So I think I've played enough of this clip from the loader. Check them out, by the way. I just played through 17 minutes of this, and it was a great explanation of what's going on that I don't really see a whole lot of people elsewhere on the internet bringing up. So kudos to the team over there.
Now, YouTube might demonetize us because we used a YouTube video.
Well, I hope
right?
not, because I'm also trying to tell people, hey, go check out their channel. I'm a huge fan of the Lotus Eaters, and Carl Benjamin and his friends over there do a really good job running a podcast where they talk about this stuff from a British perspective, and there's a lot of overlap between what we talk about and what they talk about. So with that said, I want to go into a couple other links here, because, hey, look who just came back, Hamilton. Hamilton, I just finished going through the part of the video that I want to go through. I now want to explain like how this is substantially worse than I think people fully realize.
All right, take us.
We are so
take
broke.
us down into the depths of this, Christian.
Despair.
Depths of despair.
So here's this article that my favorite economist, Lynn Alden, wrote several years ago in 2019, all the way back in the BC era before COVID. And she wrote this in, I believe, October 2019. But, yep, it was October 2019. But this is just an incredible an analogy that explains the issue. It's a bit long, but bear with me because I think you're going to appreciate this. So she has this analogy, and she says, prior to about 50 years ago, right after Nixon dropped the gold standard, we were basically trading in gold and silver. Now, you still had paper money, right? But you could exchange it for gold and silver, right? We were on what's called the gold standard. And so she comes up with an analogy to explain the problem with trade deficits in a way that I think at least partially refutes the typical libertarian response that somebody like Nick and I usually would espouse when it comes to questions about trade. So she has this analogy called the land of silk and the land of iron. And she goes on to say that the land of silk is known for producing, well, obviously silk, right? It produces luxury goods. And the land of iron is rich in its mineral deposits and engineering prowess, and it makes weapons and tools. Each country starts with, say, 1,000 tons of gold. So this is back when you still have the gold standard. Let's say this is like the Middle Ages. The people in the land of iron want luxuries, and the people in the land of silk want iron. And so obviously they trade with each other. Now, so things are going well right now. You have a free market. There's no trade barriers, no tariffs, right? Both countries are trading with each other for the thing that the other one wants. This is exactly the type of system that Nick and I say that we need to have, right? It's a free trade system where you have comparative advantage, right? We don't produce silk, but we want it. And they don't produce iron, but they want iron. And so we trade with each other. But there's a problem because each year the land of iron buys 300 tons of gold and the land of silk only buys 200 tons worth of iron. And so the land of iron is now, again, they're buying 100 tons more of silk than their neighbors are buying of their products. So what happens is that every year, 100 tons worth of gold is physically shipped from the land of iron to the land of silk in the form of a trade deficit. And this is coming from thousands of individual transactions, as Alden brings up in her analogy. So again, the land of silk is producing more than they consume and are getting richer, while the land of iron are consuming more than they produce, and thus are living above their means. So now you fast forward after 10 years of doing this, and now the land of iron has run out of gold, while the land of silk has 2,000 tons of gold. So now the land of iron is broke and can no longer buy luxuries from the land of silk. However, the people in the land of silk can still buy weapons and tools. So for the next few years, the people in the land of iron go without luxuries or with a lot fewer luxuries than before, while they're still working hard to keep producing their iron tools and weapons to rebuild their country's gold supplies from the land of silk. They have to do this by necessity. And so the land of iron has to, just simple laws of economics, they have to produce a small trade surplus to make up for the 10 years of massive trade deficits that they were running, where they were living above their means. This illustrates why trade deficits tend to be self-correcting after a while. A country becomes broke and can't buy as much, and they get more desperate to sell things, so they export their goods and services to become more competitive. But the people in the land of iron start to grow restless and depressed from this new reality, working so hard and going without luxuries. The process of rebuilding their wealth is taking too long and is no fun at all. There's talk of rebellion in the air. Some of the iron leaders get together and debate what to do about this growing discontent. Let's go to war and take back our gold, says the venerable General Vladimir von Ironborn IV. They're a bunch of dress-weaving weaklings. The problem, says Lady Gemsworth, is that we've already sold these weaklings quite a number of weapons, and rumor has it they've also procured some defense services from the land of warriors with some of their huge stockpiles of gold. I don't think we can win a war. But I have a better idea. She comes out with an idea and she says, I traveled last month to the land of silk. Several of their merchants have agreed to open up lines of credit. We can start buying luxuries again, but instead of paying with gold, since we don't have any, we'll start to give them tools and weapons like we always do, in addition to small percentages of our business and properties every year. That will keep our people happy for now until we can figure out a better solution. And so, for the next few years, the land of iron keeps sending weapons and tools to the land of silk like before, but the land of silk has now resumed sending luxuries to the land of iron. But since there are more luxuries being sent than tools and weapons, the difference is now being made up in business equity and property value flowing from the merchants of the land of iron to the loaners in the land of silk. Now, if this continues, Lynn Alden says, Lady Gemsworth has now put the land of iron in an even worse situation because not only now do they have no gold, but in addition, the land of silk now owns an increasing percentage of the land of iron's properties and are entitled to various dividends, rents, and other incomes from those assets. Now, this goes beyond just a simple trade deficit and now extends to other problems where basically the land of iron is auctioning off their own country to foreigners to pay for the privilege of, again, living above their means. Now, this would be bad enough once the merchants in the land of silk no longer extend credit to the land of iron, or they demand ridiculous terms to the point that the land of iron simply defaults on its debts. So with less generous lines of credit from the land of silk, the land of iron will eventually, inevitably, be forced into buying fewer luxuries and continue focusing on rebuilding its gold reserves by producing more than it consumes. Spending so many years consuming more than they produce might have made them look and feel rich on the surface, but their real wealth has diminished, and eventually they run out of ways to keep it going. So, do you guys get the analogy?
Is that when Nixon pulled us off the gold standard?
That was
Good question.
That was step one
Yeah.
in the bankruptcy process.
Yeah. That
So-
was that first little bit, right?
So remember how like the land of iron ran out of gold and they said, well, but we want to keep importing silk. So now we're going to do something else. We're going to offer something else. We'll just take on debt to do it. And then eventually they can't pay the debt. So then it's like, well, then we'll auction off our assets in our country, to you, the merchants in this foreign country. So that way you can keep sending us stuff. Well, what happens when even that runs out? So now you've run out of gold and you've run up the credit cards so much that you just physically can't take on any more debt. Nobody will extend you debt. And you've now sold off all of your companies, all those iron mills in your country that are making the tools and weapons that you're exporting.
Now they're
You've
owned by...
sold off those the shares of those companies to foreigners, the very foreigners that are sending you the goods. You know the analogy of Chick-fil-A that I brought up earlier?
Yeah.
And the whole, well, I have a huge trade deficit with Chick-fil-A, and what's the problem? That's the typical libertarian response. Here's the problem. What happens when I lose my job?
Right,
And I no longer have any money to pay Chick-fil-A anymore, but I keep buying Chick-fil-A anyway.
Okay.
That's where the libertarian analogy falls apart. And so it's great that I can have a huge trade deficit with Chick-fil-A. That's the free market. But it's only great up until the point that I physically can't keep running the trade deficit with them. I can do it because I get paid money. But what happens when I get fired from my job? Hopefully I never get fired, right? But what happens when I lose my job and I lose my money? Well, I can't keep buying from Chick-fil-A anymore. But what happens if I decide, well, but I still want Chick-fil-A.
But I still want these
luxuries. Want it. I
Yeah.
still want these luxuries.
Yeah.
You got to pay the piper eventually.
So does this have anything to do with China buying land in the United States?
Why do you think they're buying land?
Is this related?
It is.
Wow.
But I'm asking the question, why do you think they're buying land in the U.S.?
Because our buying treasuries is...
Because we're auctioning off our country to the Chinese to pay for the privilege of importing their cheap goods. Because we can't make them ourselves. And we don't have any money left to pay them with because we're bankrupt. We owe $36 trillion in debt. And you know what? It's even worse than that. Because let me show you the next thing that's going to be truly horrifying here.
Oh, man, it gets worse.
It gets way worse. It gets way worse. Because remember, we don't pay with gold. So that medieval analogy doesn't work anymore because we're not on that system anymore. We pay with printed money, with fake money that has no real value. We're just printing it, and then we're paying for goods. And so she goes on to explain that unlike gold that's in a fixed amount, central banks can easily issue more money, which might dilute the value of each unit of money depending on various characteristics related to, global supply and demand. But then she goes on to say a country with a consistent trade surplus and current account surplus builds up larger amounts of wealth in the form of bonds of other currencies, gold luxuries, equity stakes in various companies and properties around the world, and so forth. People in other countries may, of course, own some other business stakes and properties in the wealthy country as well. But the net international investment position is that the wealthy country owns a lot more assets than in other countries than those countries own of its assets. Now, a country with a consistent trade deficit and current account deficit builds up debts to those other countries, and it finds its reserves depleted, and it sells off some of its assets to foreigners. It's often very gradual and not visible. Even a seemingly booming economy can be refinanced under the surface via foreign investment and ownership. Countries with trade surplus and current account surplus generally find that their currencies go up in value. More money flows into the country than flows out of the country year after year. And some of this wealth essentially gets stored in the strength of its currency. Due to its stability and sustainable wealth, more people from all over the world want to own its currency. In addition, more people want to buy properties and business stakes in that country, which means they have to convert their currency units into that rich country's currency. Hence, there is a substantial demand for that currency. This increased demand pushes up the value of that currency, all else being equal. What she just described in that paragraph is the United States right after World War II. We produced a ton of stuff. We exported a ton of stuff. The rest of the world had just blown itself up to bits. And so we indirectly tragically, we kind of benefited from that. I'm not saying that wasn't the only reason. We were an industrial superpower, even absent of World War II. But after World War II, we were the last man standing. We weren't bombed. We had all the factories. We produced everything. We were super rich, like truly rich. We had a strong currency, a strong economy. We were exporting all sorts of stuff. We didn't need anything from the rest of the world. We all made it at home. And the rest of the world needed us because we were loaning them money too to pay for the war and to pay for the previous war before that. And so this paragraph that she's describing is the state of the United States right after World War II, where we were super wealthy, super powerful. We didn't owe anybody anything. They owed us money. We were loaning them and shipping them goods. And we had the world's most powerful military. We were at the peak of American economic, cultural, and military dominance. But she goes on to say, this has a self-correcting effect, however, because a more expensive currency means that the products and services of that country are more expensive for people in other countries to buy, and they might therefore buy fewer goods from that country. Their trade surplus and current account surplus may slowly diminish or level out. Sometimes wealthy nations intentionally try to devalue their currencies to prevent their exports from becoming non-competitive. The same self-correcting force happens for countries on the other side of the balance. Countries might run chronic chronic current account deficits that eventually forces a crisis that results in a weakened currency. This means they can't buy as many foreign goods, but their exports become more competitive and attractive to other countries. In other words, it forces them to consume less and helps them to produce more, which brings the balance back towards a sustainable level. Now, she gives an example of Argentina that I'm going to skip over because here's where it comes into play with the United States. And this is the last part of this whole thing.
And then we're going to tie it back to tariffs.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In case you're wondering, this is relevant. You might be thinking this isn't relevant. I promise you it's relevant. I know I'm reading a whole lot, but I promise you we're going somewhere.
We know to stick with you, Christian. We know.
Okay. So the United States has the reserve currency, right? And it's had it for, since Bretton Woods. And it's been a fiat currency since 1971. So that makes it a bit unique compared to the rest of the world. Because this gives the United States a huge advantage in that it can print almost endless dollars. And it gives the United States the ability to pay for hard commodities in the form of printing money. Other countries have to earn dollars in exchange for those commodities. So what that means is that the dollar becomes stronger than it otherwise would be And it strengthens, it basically, she goes on to say that it strengthens our military projection capabilities around the world with hundreds of military bases. But it also triggers what's known as Triffin's dilemma. Now, you might not have heard of Triffin's dilemma. I'm willing to bet that a huge chunk of our audience has never heard of it. I guarantee you will hear the word Triffin's dilemma at some point in the future. This might be your first time. I promise you it will not be your last time hearing it. This was discovered in the 1950s by the economist Robert Triffin, who noted that maintaining the reserve currency means you must supply enough dollars to the world to use the currency. The world can't use Swiss francs as the reserve currency, for example, because there simply aren't enough of them. It has to be a big country, and that country needs to run a persistent and current account deficit that supplies the rest of the world with its currency that supplies the rest of the world with its currency, and they supply it with goods and services in return. This works for a time, but eventually undermines the economy of the country that has the reserve currency. So a reserve currency gives the country tremendous power, but it also essentially places a curse on it and guarantees that that position cannot last forever. When Triffin pointed out his dilemma, the U.S. was on a gold standard, and he said this wouldn't be sustainable. For the next decade, gold indeed kept leaving the country, and in 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard and ended convertibility from dollars into gold. And for decades since then, the United States has had a current account deficit. It reached 3% of GDP in the mid-1980s until the Plaza Accord revalued the dollar's strength, which helped fix the deficit briefly. But then it spiked to 6% GDP after self-correcting during the 2008 crisis. And now, when she says now she's writing in 2019, it's sitting at 2.5% of GDP each year. Due to decades of these deficits, the United States has indeed developed a large negative net international investment position, equal to about 50% of US GDP. Here's this chart where she shows, remember, this chart is going back to the analogy of the land of iron and silk. This is how many more dollars does the rest of the world own of American assets minus the amount of value of foreign assets that Americans own of the rest of the world. In 2019, it was negative 50% of our entire GDP. So that's like $11 trillion net that the rest of the world owns of the US compared to what the US owns of the rest of the world. So we're no longer paying to import stuff from the rest of the world in the form of gold. We ran out of that in 1971. That's phase one. And then we started borrowing to import from the rest of the world. That's phase two. And then we started auctioning off our country, starting in about 1987, to the rest of the world. That's phase three. So we ran out of gold. We're eventually going to run out of the ability to borrow money. What happens when we run out of our own country to sell off, to keep importing cheap Chinese goods? So that way, 20-something-year-old TikTok women who do email jobs get, a cheap laptop or cheap TV or cheap car. Because guess what happened? In 2019, it was 50% of GDP. Take a guess where it is today. Today, it has gone from... No, I can't, unfortunately. Let me zoom in. Let me see if I can zoom in. Does this work, Nate? Okay. In 2019, it was negative 11 trillion. Today, it is negative 26 trillion.
Oh my gosh.
It is now 90% of our GDP. This is not the national debt. This is the net negative balance of how much more the entire world owns of American assets than we own of the entire rest of the world's assets.
When you say assets, that's land, that's equity
real
in
estate,
companies,
buildings,
that's stock
stocks,
market,
bonds, anything of value in the United States. It's all
so
of
the
it.
rest of the world owns more of those assets than the U.S. does.
So is this why we need everything to crash? And here's one thing
This is why Trump is putting in tariffs, because
hold on. I have
Okay.
a question about that. Because I keep seeing people say, oh, every time we get into a trade war with tariffs and everything, it ushers in a recession or a depression.
We're already in a depression.
Is that what
we just don't realize it?
Yeah, it's just going to reveal it.
What happens? What happens if the dollar disappears tomorrow? I'm not saying it will, but like think about it for a minute. We are importing trillions of dollars worth of goods a year, more than we're exporting. We owe $36 trillion in debt, and the net balance of value is negative 26 trillion more that the rest of the world owns of our stuff than we own of the rest of the world. Now, Americans own properties in Japan and South Korea, and they own European stocks and Asian stocks. There's Americans that invest in, and Warren Buffett owns a whole bunch of Japanese stocks. But the Japanese own way more of us than we own of them. The Chinese own way more of us than we own of them. The Europeans own way more of us than we own of them.
So what ends up happening, and is there a way, like, are we going to see some kind of a correction after everything completely goes to crap? And
this is why I said that I'm going to give you like a hyper black pill in this episode, because we are maintaining a standard of living that we physically could not maintain if it weren't for the fact that we control the reserve currency of the world. When that goes, the United States almost immediately goes into a second Great Depression. Not a 2008 financial crash, not a recession, a depression. And when I say depression, it's actually worse than the first depression. Because in 1929, the United States was a manufacturing industrial powerhouse. We exported more than we imported in the 1920s and 30s. Even in the Great Depression, when we had 25% unemployment, we were a largely self-sustaining country that it was a hard time, but we survived. We still had the ability to make stuff at home. And we were a net loaner, creditor to other countries around the world. That's part of the reason that when the crash happened here and we stopped loaning the rest of the world money, the rest of the world went also bankrupt, also slipped into a depression because we stopped giving them loans. And so in 1929, we had manufacturing. We did not import $2 trillion or $1.5 trillion worth of goods every single year. We didn't need to import anything. We did import stuff, right? But we had a relatively even balance. We basically imported as much as we exported. In fact, many times we exported more than we imported. And we didn't owe anybody anything in 1929. They owed us money because of World War I. The British and the French and the Germans, because of the Treaty of Versailles, not that we signed the Treaty of Versailles, but Dawes Plan and Young Plan and stuff like that. The European powers, they owed us money. We didn't owe them anything. And so we had manufacturing. We made stuff at home. We exported stuff. We didn't owe anybody anything. And yet look at what happened to our country in the 1930s.
Yeah, but you can also argue that it was the devastation was prolonged artificially because of government action. It was.
But you know what wasn't? Was the crash itself.
Right.
Now, think about where we are today. We don't export stuff. We import trillions of dollars worth of stuff. We don't loan money to people. They loan money to us. We don't own other people's assets. They own 90% worth, the equivalent of 90% of our entire GDP. And we were just talking earlier today in the podcast about how the GDP number's fake anyway, because it's fueled by money printing. And so we talk about how the United States is this first world country where we have this luxurious standard of living. We're so much better off than everybody else. And Trump is just ruining things with these tariffs. Doesn't he understand that we're making ourselves poor because of that? Why would we want to go back to making stuff in the United States? We're rich. We've evolved our economy to the point where we don't need to make these things. We can just import them. No, it's all fake. It's all fake. And all the tariffs are doing is exposing how truly bankrupt we are. Because if we didn't have the dollar to pay for all the cheap goods that we're importing from the rest of the world and funding the auctioning off of our own country to the entire rest of the world, we would have a literal second Great Depression strike our country. And it would be worse than the first Great Depression because at least we made stuff at home. At least we had other people owe us debts rather than the other way around. Think about how many goods and services we would have to export in order to pay off all of this stuff.
People are asking for a white pill. I don't think Christian has a white pill.
There is no white pill. The white pill is this.
We're
don't
at
have
about
to-
an hour and 45 minutes, so we really need to.
Here's the white pill, and then I'll open it up because I've been filibustering this whole time, and I want your guys. I don't think you guys realized where I was going with this at the end, but you get why I said this might be the most haunting podcast we've ever done, because what I'm trying to say here is that we have a standard of living that is almost completely, not completely, but almost completely sustained by fake money printing and debt issuance and auctioning off our own country to the rest of the world, so that way we can import their stuff to sustain our fake standard of living. If we want to maintain the standard of living that we enjoy today, rather than go through a depression unlike anything this country has ever witnessed, we have to get into the habit of being able to live within our own means. And that means making the very things that we're buying for ourselves. Because you cannot run a trade deficit forever. Just like how I can't go to Chick-fil-A forever if I lose my job. My job is the equivalent of the dollar in this analogy. When the dollar goes, and it will go, because you can't run multi-trillion-dollar deficits every single year and expect the entire rest of the world to just buy our debt forever. Eventually, they will stop buying it. And then what's going to happen? We fund it ourselves. Then we get hyperinflation. And how are we going to maintain our standard of living if we're importing all the things that are allowing us to enjoy the American dream? The American dream was never supposed to be, I get to import stuff from China. That was never what the American dream is supposed to be. So say whatever you want about tariffs. You can complain all day long. This isn't free trade. This is protectionism. Yes, it is protectionism. It's protecting us from going bankrupt and going through a second Great Depression worse than the first one. And it sucks that that has to happen. I don't want that to happen. I don't want trade barriers. I want free trade. But you know what? When you have 50 years of fake money printing, you can't get away with free trade because we have no ability to compete with the rest of the world. We have to make stuff at home. If we don't make anything at home, when the dollar goes, our entire country is going to implode. We are going to go through the worst economic crash ever in human history if we don't start making stuff at home and we wean ourselves off of the debt-fueled money printing that we've been on for 50 years. We've had 50 years of politicians in Washington, D.C. mortgage our futures, and the bill is about to come due. And we have a man right now that is saying, we need to avoid the doomsday scenario that I just laid out. The only way we can do that is if we stop spending money and we start making stuff at home, because we cannot keep living on a credit card forever.
So the Trump administration clearly does not think that they can communicate this problem to the American people in.
It's extremely complex,
It is.
and people tune out.
It took us an hour and 48 minutes to get here.
I mean, we have a society right now that sucks its own life away 15 seconds at a time on an app.
Yeah.
They don't have the attention span to understand what's going on here. And I feel like we barely scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
And, you know, there are some people that are interested enough in this to stick around and to actually hear it out. But it also isn't good news. And people oftentimes, they're not willing to hear bad news, even if it's the truth, even if it's going to affect them. They just want to put their head in the sand and they want to go, it's never going to affect me, so I don't care. But we have to care, right?
So obviously one of the things that people are saying is that these tariffs are going to lead to higher prices, and then midterms are going to be a bloodbath, and the left is going to, take Congress back.
This is why Trump's doing it right now.
Yeah.
Because
But
he's trying
there-
to buy as much time as possible for us to hopefully start reshoring stuff immediately. Because yes, it is going. Here's the truth. Higher prices are coming no matter what.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter the mechanism. Tariffs are one mechanism. You know another mechanism that you get higher prices? Hyperinflation.
Which we've already experienced some of that.
Well,
and-
we haven't experienced hyperinflation,
Okay.
right? But we've
Inflation.
experienced
I
inflation.
mean, there's a bunch of prices that are coming down. There's
the
other
bill
prices
is coming
that are
due no
going
matter
up.
what.
Yeah.
You cannot live forever. The libertarian argument for free trade falls apart, again, when you lose your job. And then your massive trade deficit with Walmart or Target or Chick-fil-A, you can't perpetuate that anymore because you literally don't have any more money. What happens when people stop buying our debt? What happens when they stop accepting the dollar? How are we going to import stuff from the rest of the world if we don't have anything that they want to buy from us?
Right.
This is very different from the first Trump administration because in my mind, Trump floated the stock market in 2020 or 2016 to 2020 to keep the idea,
gravy train rolling.
Keep it rolling. But now, why is he doing anything different now?
I think it's for a variety of reasons. One, he's always believed this.
Yeah.
2, he's term limited.
Yep.
And 3, he's got people around him that have seen all the same stuff that we just went through. All the same
He's
charts.
getting better guidance this time than he was the first time too. And the other thing I was going to say is, like, this isn't going to get better. It probably in Trump's lifetime. I don't think it's going to resolve itself in his lifetime. He's doing his best to try to make that happen, but the results of what he's doing right now, we might not even see within the short term.
What's interesting about this is we always talk about, politicians doing something, but then the other side getting elected and turning what they just did right back around.
Yeah, and that happens.
But if corporations are building manufacturing plants in the States, they're not going to leave those plants and just go right back overseas.
Well,
no, what'll happen is we will come on hard times. They will put, Democrats in office again, and the effects of what the austerity measures that we've gone through will finally kick in. We'll start seeing the effects of them, and people will wrongly believe that it was the Democrats that brought us out of it. And the reason why is because people don't seem to realize that nothing happens overnight.
Right.
It's the wheels of this train move very, very slowly. This machine,
but the train is derailing very slowly. And eventually it's not going to be slow anymore.
What I'm saying is we are going to get to the point where they're going to put Democrats back in, and then they're going to be able to go, oh, look, the Democrats pull us out of this because the effects of this are not going to be immediate.
Do you get now why I'm so critical of the fact that we're the reserve currency? Because it was the ultimate curse. It crushed our country. And in 1946, we were genuinely, not fake, we were genuinely wealthy. Like, we were truly rich. Now, obviously, we were poor off compared to today because of technological advancement, right? But like the type of world that I would like to live in is one where you have the U.S. in the 40s or 50s with modern technological convenience, where you're actually wealthy. It's not fake. There's actual real productivity, real wealth generation taking place. But we became the reserve currency after World War II, and being the reserve currency is like the ring of Sauron. It makes you powerful, but it corrupts you. And it's a double-edged sword. It's like there's all sorts of like myths and legends of like something that makes you incredibly powerful, but at an immense price. And eventually it's like the curse is, it's just not worth it. Like, we deindustrialized and then bankrupted our own country for the sake of being the reserve currency of the world. It is not worth it. It gives you empire for a while, but it destroys your own country over a long period of time.
So what is the administration's messaging strategy have to be for the 4 years to go by, Vance to get elected, and to continue this process?
It has to be this. The entire rest of the world is taking advantage of us and ripping us off, and we are making up for 50 years of bad trade deals.
Which is why he's got his chart.
Which is why he's saying all this stuff. But what's actually happening behind the scenes is that's not what happened. We're paying the price of 50 years of us being the fiat global reserve currency. Now, it is true that the rest of the world absolutely took advantage of us, because what did we do with that? Well, we protected the rest of the world from the Soviets for 50 years. And so you're going to get a huge, huge rift between the U.S. and its historical allies, because we're basically going to be telling them, we're going bankrupt, and you guys are part of the reason indirectly that we're going bankrupt, because we spent 50 years defending you. So you're on your own, Europe and NATO and, all these other countries, unless you start paying us directly. And by paying us, we really mean you need to start opening up plants in our country so that way we can start making stuff. Because we do not want to, we know the dollar is going to go away, The worst case scenario is the United States is not in a position to maintain itself in terms of industry once the dollar is gone. That is how you get the second Great Depression scenario. We have got to start making stuff. And again, I don't mean fake email jobs. We have to start making stuff before we lose the dollar. Otherwise, our standard of living goes from the pinnacle of human existence to we get utterly crushed. Like I'm talking about a drop in standard of living unlike anything in the entire history of this country.
So Harrison has a question, and I also have one too. But Harrison's question is, what year will all this doom befall the U.S. in the world of nothing change?
If I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I'd be
in the administration.
I'd be in the administration trying to save this country.
Yeah.
Nobody knows the exact date or time that this happens.
Okay, here's my question. Why isn't Elon on board with all of this?
He's on board with part of it. He wants to cut the debt, right?
Sure. Well,
because
he's part of the process. Yeah.
Here's the reason why. Because the traditional Republican conservative argument is free trade. Tariffs are a tax. Tariffs are protective. Tariffs are a trade barrier. I've seen people say this is a command economy, which is honestly, that's actually kind of historically ignorant, because what you're saying is that the entire world ran on a command Stalinist economy until the Washington Consensus, which is just absurd. But you have this built in, and it makes sense, because under a normal, I want to stress this, under normal market conditions where you didn't have any of this nonsense going on, where we were screwing ourselves to protect our status as the reserve currency of the world with money printing and debt issuance. Under normal circumstances, if we were not the reserve currency of the world, I would absolutely be in support of free trade, without question. I've not changed my position on that. And that is the position that the average Republican has. Why would I support tariffs? That's a tax. It's cronyism. You're picking winners and losers. It's protectionism. It's central planning, which I disagree with that last part, but that's a technical argument. The broader argument, I agree with all of those critiques. And so that's where Elon's coming from, is the traditional Republican perception. But the problem is the traditional Republican perception is ignoring all of this stuff.
Yeah. He's also been one of the few people to build a company in the United States and for his product to primarily be built in the States already.
Yeah.
Every Tesla in America is made in America.
So as we wind down, like, do you have something to say to wrap us up? And 'cause a lot of times, you guys, we discuss things, and then often Nick will feel the need to encourage folks at the end, because sometimes these are really depressing episodes and he'll feel like we need to encourage. But really, the purpose of making the argument is so that we're not out there being ignorant to what's going on, and that we can understand some of these complex issues and talk semi-intelligently with others about it. And that's the point. The point isn't that we all walk away from here being like, but it's all going to be okay. It's more of, I am armed now with information and an argument to be able to now have an intelligent conversation with others on the topic.
My takeaway from this is I need to buy land ASAP and start growing food ASAP.
Right.
That's my takeaway.
Build your bunker now.
Yeah, I need to do the
Brought to
same
you by
thing.
Freedom Water.
And
I mean,
good ranchers.
Do I have to do the closing out? I see. I love when we do podcasts where, like, I say a bunch of stuff and then we have a discussion about that stuff.
And then
'cause
Nick has to
sometimes
do all the cleanup. No, you get to clean up your own mess today.
Nick is going to listen to this,
Christian.
and he's going to be. I'm scared that Nick is going to be like furious with me. He's going to be like, Christian, you violated the rule of not leaving people depressed, and you need to like.
No,
Well,
Christian, go ahead.
I do think that this is a calling upon all of us to build stronger communities.
Yes, it is.
Build stronger families. If a depression happens, we are screwed if we can't grow our own food. And
The good news is we do grow our own food. We don't import food.
But I mean, if there's a Great Depression like what you're talking about, everybody individually needs to be responsible for their own food. And yeah, I need to buy some land.
I'm not saying we're going to starve to death. We are definitely self-sufficient as a country on food.
Well, that's encouraging. That's really encouraging.
The point is, don't let others remain ignorant around you. Like, I think one of the reasons we've ended up where we are is because there were the golden rules of don't talk politics and don't talk religion. You guys, like if anything has taught us, you must talk politics and you must talk religion, and it can't all be prescriptive. You have to understand what you're talking about. And when people throw things back at you, you're going to need to do the research to be able to stand on your own 2 feet with this. This discussion has to be had with others all around. And unfortunately, we live in a society where people are more concerned about who Justin Bieber is married to and whether or not they're going to survive having a baby, than they care about what's happening to our own neighbors, and our own country. And so, like, we kind of need to get our head out of the clouds and become proactive. And obviously you guys are here, which is why, like, you guys are the proactive ones. But the call to action to me is don't let others remain ignorant of this.
Yeah. But even after sitting in on this episode and being here in the room, I still feel like I need to learn more to be able to intelligently talk about all of this, and especially summarize it in just a few paragraphs and not need to take an hour and a half to fully explain it. So Christian, where can I go after this to learn more about it, to do more research other than following you on Twitter?
Follow Christian on Twitter.
I actually wasn't going to suggest that, although I do need to put out some probably tweet threads talking about this issue. There's a few people that I would recommend. I mean, you're welcome to go watch that video from the Lotus Eaters where they kind of briefly touch, at least on the surface level, about the problem. But there's some other economists that have discussed this. This essay thread that I went through earlier was from my favorite economist, Lynn Alden, who wrote a book called Broken Money, where she talks about this. And it came out just a few years ago. And I would recommend checking her out because, by the way, she's not a Keynesian. She's certainly not an MMT advocate.
Yeah.
She's got a bit of an Austrian streak in her. I don't know if I would necessarily call her an Austrian, but she believes in sound money. She's a big fan of gold and Bitcoin and commodities and not fiat currency. She has her most heretical view is she doesn't think governments should be issuing currencies.
I love that.
So, like, she understands the problem and she's talking about this issue. I mean, she's written several articles on this issue. I'm not saying that she endorses tariffs, but she understands the reason why people like Trump are pushing for tariffs right now, because we're in a silent crisis and nobody understands that we are like standing over an abyss basically, and that we have to solve this problem or else it's going to end very poorly for a lot of people. I would also recommend checking out Brent Johnson, who came up with the dollar milkshake theory. He's certainly at least tangentially related to some of the topics that we talked about today, because the dollar milkshake theory is a theory that I believe is correct about how this is all going to end, like the actual process that's going to lead to everything blowing up. And he says it doesn't have a happy ending, but it's not as if the United States is the only one that suffers. The rest of the world does suffer from the dollar milkshake because we're forcing them into default, basically. So everybody loses. The question is who loses more. And that's what Trump is trying to do, is put us in a position that when the system fails, we don't lose more than what we have to. And that's why he's pushing the tariff stuff. And that's the only reason that I am supportive of tariffs. If it was under any other circumstances, I would be opposed.
Sure.
So like those are the two people that I would recommend checking out if you want to learn a little bit more about this. And I'm sure this is a super convoluted, counterintuitive topic that I'm sure we'll probably visit again at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But the white pill that I will leave people with, Nick, I promise I'm going to make an attempt here to leave on a positive note. The white pill is this is all self-inflicted. There is no force, no mechanism that forces us to be poor. The United States has the ability to come roaring back if we allow it to happen. But we have to allow it to happen. We have to cut taxes. We have to cut, especially regulations. We have to create a positive pro-business environment. We have to stop rewarding BS, fake, wokeified, financialized elements of the economy that are simply leeching off of the productive aspects of the economy. We have to return to real savings, real productivity, sound money. We need to do all of those things. And guess what? If we do those things, we'll be totally fine off. We'll be as rich as we were in 1946 with all the modern conveniences and luxuries that we have. It's totally doable. We have the people, we have the skills, we have the educated workforce. We have all the ability in the world to fix this problem. That's the white pill. And it does not have to be. I said that we're heading for a second Great Depression. It doesn't have to be. There is an ability for us to have a soft landing, but we have to start teeing ourselves up now for the post-dollar scenario. If we do that now, and Trump's administration is trying it, and you can criticize the methods that they're attempting, but you can't criticize the end goal that they're trying to bring about. If we work towards that right now, we can avoid all of the catastrophe, not all of it. There will be pain, right? But we can avoid some of the catastrophe that's coming. Because at the end of the day, the whole reason we're in this situation is because we've had 50 years of politicians lying about where the money's coming from, right? Don't touch Social Security. Don't touch Medicare. Let's expand entitlements. Let's have the Great Society. Let's have, Medicaid Part D. Let's, wage all these wars. Let's do all these things. Let's spend all this money. And the money is actually coming from somewhere. It's coming from you. It's coming from your future standard of living. They've mortgaged our futures, and the bill will eventually come due. You cannot create money out of nothing. And that's what 50 years of budget deficits and trade deficits are, is you have to pay for that at some point. And the bill will eventually come due. I can't give you an exact date. If I could, I'd be quite rich, right? But the bill is coming due eventually, and we need to start acting now if we want to avoid disaster.
Well, Christian, thank you for putting all of this together and your research and your 2-hour 2-hour conversation with me on Sunday about this. Many good episodes to come.
Yeah. Thank you guys for being with us, even though Nick's not here, and sticking around this long. Yep. And thank you to Good Ranchers for sponsoring this episode.
Right. Promo code Nick, 40% off. It's good stuff.